Welcome, Mama. It is Sam here with some updates on the Becoming Mama podcast. First, we're going to be starting every episode with a little intro like this so that you know what the podcast is going to be about and you know exactly what to look forward to. I'll also include some updates like this if we have any. The second thing is we're going to continue to do wins and losses. However, we're not going to be doing them in every episode anymore because we want to get right to the topic. So for that reason, we're going to have a dedicated podcast at the end of the month for wins and losses, for chit chat, just a relax, kind of fit episode for Emmy and myself. We're also going to be doing more of a balance of podcasts like that, guest podcasts with just Emmy and I talking about a topic, and birth stories. So we would love to have you or your suggestions for who you would like to have on the podcast. So please use the links down below to either send us a DM, to submit the form, or you can always send us an email as well. We truly would love to have you on the podcast. Now, in this podcast, we are talking all about mom guilt with Dr. Caroline Dickens. It is one of my favorite podcasts we have ever done. We talk about what mom guilt is, how do we overcome it, what it can feel like, what can lead to it, and truly, where does it come from? Why is it so pervasive in our lives? It is a fascinating conversation, and we talk about our experiences with it, and Caroline gives her insights on how we can work through it and hold space for that emotion and continue to live our lives. So if that interests you, keep listening and be sure before you leave to rate the podcast, review it, follow, subscribe, all of those things. It helps us out a ton. So without further ado, here it is, Mom Guilt with Dr. Caroline Dickens. Welcome back to the Becoming Mama podcast, where two long-lost best friends discuss all things motherhood. I am Sam, and I am joined with my co-host, Emmy.
Hey, everybody.
And we are also joined with our special guest today, Dr. Caroline Dickens. She is a mom to a 1-year-old boy, a licensed clinical psychologist specializing in anxiety, life transitions, and identity development. She is especially passionate about helping expecting and postpartum moms navigate those issues during the transition into motherhood. Hello, Caroline.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me. So excited to be here.
We are so excited to have you. I cannot rave more about Caroline than I probably already have. She has a phenomenal Instagram account. So you should go follow her right now before you pause this podcast. Go follow her at Dr. Caroline Dickens. She talks a lot about the experience of transition to motherhood, matrescence, and a lot about postpartum rage, postpartum anxiety, all of these really difficult topics, and does it in such a wonderful way. And she has a program called Becoming Mom, which is how we connected. We were like, this is too organic. So we are so excited to have you. Our main topic today is going to be mom guilt. So we're going to be talking about where that comes from, what that feels like, what the root of that can be, and then how we can overcome that. But before we do that, we just want to get into a little bit more about you and how you got into this area. Does that sound good?
Yeah, sounds great. And thank you so much for that intro. I really appreciate the support and the love.
Well,
So my kind of interest in this area really came from my own experience. I've always been interested in working with women, and issues around women's health that has always been kind of a focus of my practice. But when I was pregnant, I was just kind of shocked by how few resources were out there that were really designed to help the woman address the issues that come with this time versus preparing for labor and delivery, preparing for baby sleep and newborn care and all of this stuff, which is so important. And I definitely dove into all of that, but there was just really not a lot out there that was around supporting the mom's experience at this time. So that really just felt like a gap in my own kind of pregnancy and postpartum journey. And I became really passionate about trying to create something that could kind of bridge that for folks, because it's so important. And it's just, I had no idea, even as a psychologist who works with moms, that it was going to be as hard as it was.
Yeah, that's fascinating to hear that it even came as a surprise to you, as I think it does to most of us. That's wild. And I think what's so interesting is when you talk about there's nothing for the mom and the mom's experience, because I feel like so often in this time span, resources for mom are still based off baby. Like, you need to do this for baby. This is, if you do this, baby will be better. Where what about mom for the sake of mom? Like, there's that, it's just such an interesting, it sets you up for that mom guilt, I think, right off the bat, and that selfless nature of like, oh, it's not good enough just for me to not feel okay. Like, there has to be a reason, like baby has to benefit for me to want to benefit, right?
100%. Yeah. And I think also just the experience of pregnancy in my mind was everyone was saying, it's such like this magical, beautiful time and you're going to love it. And I was so sick. I was so anxious, like more so than I'd ever
Mm.
been in my life. I was one of the first of my friends to go through this process. So I really didn't know who to talk to. Um, and it just felt really lonely. And I was really surprised by that because everyone else in my life was coming to me saying like, oh, are you so excited? Are you feeling so good? And I was like, kinda. I mean, that's part of the experience, but that's certainly not the whole experience. It's hard to talk about because of all of these external expectations. And you're exactly right. That's where the mom guilt starts.
Yeah. That's just wild. Yeah. Question of like, aren't you happy? Aren't you feeling good? Like that can be really hard to answer when no, but am I allowed to say that? You know?
Totally. Or am I even allowed to feel it?
Yeah.
Like, is there something wrong with me that this is what's going on?
Right. Yes. What was postpartum like for you?
Postpartum was such a roller coaster. Those like hormones in the first couple of days really threw me for a loop. I was just like, everything was making me cry every day for the first couple of weeks. There were like a couple hours in the evening or afternoon where I was just like, what have I done? Like, what is this what my life is going to be like forever now? Like, just this really intense, like, heavy dread and, like, kind of sense of regret. And it was just a couple hours a day, but it was like really heavy. And that kind of just like dissipated on its own after the first couple of weeks. But the experience continued to be really difficult and, really high highs, really low lows. Even within the same like hour sometimes. So just a really intense experience. And I was not prepared for that, or kind of the
Mm.
intensity of like the vacillation of how I'd be feeling and the types of things I'd be thinking. And, these like really lovely warm moments with my family and also these really lonely moments of like, oh God, this is hard. This is my life now. And I don't know how I feel about that.
I like that could have come out of my mouth. That I remember those exact moments, especially in those early days of like my thing was realizing that he now depended on me and realizing it wasn't just breastfeeding, it was that I was going to have to pack his lunches and make his dinners, and like this is
Uh-huh.
forever. Like it was just those realizations and that are so blown out of proportion in the early days, especially because it feels so all encompassing. So when did you really start to think about, okay, there's this gap and I want to start like creating something for moms who are maybe in the same position as I am, or to help them overcome the things that I did?
Really during pregnancy, I started to think like this is something that is interesting to me and that I think is really important and really does need more attention. So that was kind of on my mind for a while. And then I think, I started working on this when I was maybe like 7 or 8 months postpartum. So that's when I really
Mm.
started to put things kind of into practice. But I think when I kind of got the idea for the structure of everything, and it's still kind of in flux because I think there's a lot of experimentation that comes in the early phases with this sort of thing. But
Yeah.
I did a like in-person mom and baby group for a few months during postpartum, and it was great. But all of the content was focused on baby care, and there were check-ins for the moms, and there was the ability to kind of connect with other people going through the same things. But um, there just really wasn't a lot of education about like here's what you might be dealing with right now, or here's some of the
Mm.
challenges that are really common at this phase in postpartum, even later on in postpartum where things are continuing to shift and change, and it doesn't get easier just as soon as the newborn phase is over. It's a really dynamic process. So kind of going through that and realizing that even like this great resource that I was lucky to connect with was not addressing this huge part of the journey. That's when I
Hmm.
really started kind of getting more specific with what I thought would be helpful.
That's awesome. Yeah, and you can check that out now. She does have becoming mom out and out there. And another resource she has is a free resource on mom guilt, and that's something that we've talked about on this podcast. We've mentioned on this podcast. We've had a guest mentioned on this podcast, but we haven't really dove into it. And so, with you being the expert that you are and having these resources, I thought this would be a really wonderful conversation to have. And so if there's nothing else you want to talk about your experience and how you got here, are you ready to dive into some mom guilt talk?
Let's do it.
Okay. So first of all, how would you kind of define mom guilt?
So I'll start with what guilt is more generally. So
Okay.
guilt is the emotion that comes up when we feel like we've violated some kind of rule or some kind of standard. And like all emotions, it is there to communicate to us that maybe we should change our action to change our behavior. So it can be a really helpful emotion if the rule or standard that we've broken is one that we've set for ourselves, because it's saying like, hey, maybe you should do something differently to realign yourself with the things that feel meaningful and, purposive in your life. Um, but mom guilt is typically coming up in response to some of these external expectations that are out there. So there are all these rules that we've been told about what it means to be a mom, what it means to be a good mom, how we should feel as a mom, what we should be doing. And especially in those early postpartum days, that's really all we have out there. We're kind of in this process of figuring out. I don't really know exactly what my own standards and rules are. So I'm really just kind of referencing the things that I've been taught. And I think that's where it comes from. There are all of these different expectations of what we should be doing, shouldn't be doing, what we should be feeling, shouldn't be feeling, all of that. And we always feel like we're breaking some kind of rule because of that. There's just so much out there that we always are referencing kind of, I thought that this is what I should be doing. It's not what I'm doing. And that's where it kind of starts to show up.
How does that feel for you, Emmy?
Yeah, I'm really enjoying this conversation so far. So it's actually making me think about how when I gave birth to my son, I have just reflected on this, so it's a new thought for me, but I'm realizing that the life that I set up for myself prior to having a baby was the life I envisioned for myself, which was to be a working mom who could do it all, and that would make me happy. And then once my baby was here and he was in my arms, the vision that I had sort of lived, which was my grandma was a stay-at-home mom, my aunt was a stay-at-home mom, and I idolized her, and I still do, was faced with this new vision of that's what I actually want. And so there was this immense guilt right on day one of, am I going to turn my back on the life that I have created for myself? Or am I going to follow through with that even though it feels wrong? Or am I going to try to shift things to create a life that aligns with this vision I actually had all along of being like the women in my life that I idolize? And realizing or feeling like there were no options and there were no choices, and the guilt was so incredibly suffocating that I think I just suffered for years until I was able to kind of sort that out within my own psyche and within my own habits and daily actions. So, yeah, listening to this conversation and hearing your thoughts, Caroline, really makes me think how big of a part of our life guilt is, but especially once we meet our baby for the first time, how it just sort of sweeps in and shifts our whole perspective on life.
What's interesting about that to me is I feel like that super mom expectation is a really big one for a lot of us. And we see women praised time and time again for being super moms, especially in the media, especially powerful women, especially successful women. They are super moms. They do it all. And so when you feel like you can't, that mom guilt is super heavy, or you feel like you have to make a choice. I feel like that's where it hits the most, where it's like, wait, I'm supposed to do it all. And now you're telling me I have to choose whether to be with my kid or not. Now you're telling me I have to choose whether to go to this networking event or take on this new client, which means then I don't get as much time with my kid, but I'm supposed to do it all. But I'm not supposed to have to do it. I'm supposed to be able to balance this, right? It just feels like, well, I should be able to, right? Because they do it and they're praised for it. And so that guilt of feeling like you're not enough is really heavy. And then like, especially in your case, I mean, when you have a lot invested into those things that you feel like you're supposed to be doing, it's even harder to make the choice that you now align with because that expectation's there.
Yeah, I think especially how you referenced this idea that it's all about kind of these rules that are laid out for us, and it's impossible to not break one rule or another when you find yourself being a mom.
Yes.
Like you're gonna break either
Totally.
your own rules or someone else's rules no matter what. And it's very conflicting.
Absolutely. And especially, I think the point you bring up, Emmy, is that this started even before becoming a mom. Like already there was this expectation that I'm going to be a working mom and I'm going to be the type of mom who does do it all. And, whatever that means to each person, it happens before we even start the process of becoming a mom. And so if we already have these preconceived ideas and then we meet our baby and things start to shift, it's just so confusing. It's really hard to figure out, like, what do I actually want? Because I already had this idea, but also there are all these people in my life telling me different things. And there's kind of this part of myself that's maybe cluing me into the idea that I want to do things differently than I thought I did. And who do I listen to? So it's really hard.
Mm-hmm.
It's really hard to kind of move through that. There's a lot of chatter. And I think also in the early postpartum days, especially, we're going to the pediatrician a lot, and, a lot of family visitors and friend visitors are coming in, and just everyone has something to say. There's so many different guidelines and thoughts that are being shared, and most of them are well meaning, but it is confusing and it makes it harder to figure out which of these things do I want to bring into kind of my own value system, and which do I want to sort of leave behind and be okay with other people feeling however they feel about that.
Mm-hmm. What's that? I love that. And I love going back to what Emmy said too, that you had this expectation and you didn't realize that maybe what you really envisioned for your motherhood was something entirely different. But we're often, and correct me if I'm wrong, Caroline, because I'm kind of new to this topic, but it's something I'm very interested in with the sociology of motherhood. We're often unaware of our expectations. We are inundated with them all of the time. And we have these expectations that we're not even cognizant of. Like, this is what the perfect mom looks like. And we all have our own version of that, right? So like Emmy's perfect mom was a working mom, what she thought was a working mom, a does it all mom, a high achiever career woman. But in reality, she also had these expectations but a good mom is a stay-at-home mom. A good mom is a mom who's with her baby. A good mom is a mom who doesn't leave her baby. And so you have all of these expectations existing at the same time that were so conflicting, but you're just even unaware that they exist because it's all coming at us from different areas, like your family members who lived this life that you saw, like these successful women you saw that lived this life that you saw. And you saw all of these as what the good mom is. But the good mom can't be all of those things. The one person can't be all of those things. So it's very fascinating to think about that. Like, yes, it starts well beyond we become mothers. And if we don't take the time to look at what are my expectations of a good mom, with their kids, and you can see what your mind has painted as this picture, and then you can kind of see how unrealistic that is. But until you do that, you're just bouncing in what Dr. Sophie Brock calls the fishbowl of motherhood, of like this expectation, this expectation, this expectation, this expectation, and that's a lot of guilt.
Yeah, 100%. There's just so much out there, and it's so hard to kind of like center ourselves and think about what of all of this noise actually feels meaningful to me or feels important
Yeah.
to me. And I think we can do a lot of this work before becoming moms, but we also have to be flexible with it, because until we meet our babies, we haven't met ourselves as moms either. We're a new
Right.
person, and there's this long transition of kind of stepping into this new role and figuring out how that fits with the rest of you. And there's
Yeah.
no right or wrong way to do it, but it's hard to kind of reconcile that with all of these preconceived ideas that we put out there for ourselves.
Yeah. Wow. That's I love this conversation so much. So one thing I also want to kind of call out within that definition that you gave is that oftentimes mom guilt is external. Like all the things that we just said now is it's not really from us. It's not our value, but it's something that we feel, that sense of we're violating this rule. But with mom guilt, often that rule is outside ourselves. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I think it certainly can come from our own rules too. The example that comes to mind for me is like, I really value being present with my son when I'm spending time with him. And if I find myself like scrolling on my phone while he's playing beside me, often I feel really guilty. And then I'm like, okay, well, that's a thing that is indicating to me that maybe I should put my phone away and reconnect with my
Mm-hmm.
son. And, I don't have to beat myself up about it, but that's a guilt that is actually communicating to me that it's time to do something a little bit differently. But if it's something like, I feel really guilty for like going to the gym a few times a week, and that means that my husband has to watch the baby and that I'm spending less time during my day with him, I can feel guilty about that and also recognize that that's coming from some external rule that a mom should spend all of her free time with her kid. That's what makes a
Mm-hmm.
good mom. And that's not something that I subscribe to, but it's still something that I've heard. It's a story I've been told. And so it's hard to kind of separate from that in those moments. And I think the key here, in terms of kind of overcoming that or living with it, is that you can feel guilty and still do the things that you want and need to be doing. So it's not about getting rid of the guilt. It's about understanding where it comes from, what it's signifying to us, and what we want to do next.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, it's so fascinating because I think it's obviously all mom guilt, right? Because it relates to motherhood, right? It's guilt that you feel as a mom in the act of mothering. But like I've actually put up a post about this before. Like I almost want to call them like two different things. It's like that guilt on being on your phone and not being present. Like that's guilt, and that's like a guiding guilt, right? Like you need that guilt to redirect you. Mom guilt often to me feels like that, like you said, like unnecessary, shame
Mm-hmm.
based, right? Like I feel like other people would judge me if they saw this because it doesn't meet their expectation. But it is all mom guilt, because it is. But yeah, interesting. um, One thing I wanted to just touch on real quick before we go into like the common contributors of mom guilt is like how this can feel, and kind of show up in your life. And I love the way that Emmy explained her experiences of mom guilt. um, and so, I mean, can you just share that real quick about like how mom guilt has shown up for you in the past?
Yeah, the example that comes to mind today is mainly around choosing schools for my kids and choosing their education and planning out the whole debate of homeschool versus public school versus private school. And it has been it's a guilt that until the decision is made is including like breastfeeding, baby wearing, you know daycare. It expands to all of the different life transitions that you go through with your kids, but it can be very challenging in terms of how it actually impacts our ability to function and be the moms that we want to be.
Yeah, yeah, I feel that. And um I feel that body sensation as well. Like right now I'm feeling a lot of guilt around daycare. I don't love our daycare. I've talked about this on the podcast before. We were going to move Teddy, and then we decided that we weren't sure, and so we didn't want to move him and then move him again or like change his routine again. But I just don't feel like it's the highest quality daycare. And every time I bring him there, I feel this like in my chest and in my like head of like this fullness and dizziness of like, are you messing up? Like, are you messing him up? Like, some of these kids are just crazy, and it's chaos in here when you come to pick him up, and like, he's not himself when he comes home. Like, it just feels like, but then like, that means I'm gonna have to change like everything about my life if I, but I have, there's just so many conflicting things, but it's just can feel so overwhelming and like take over your whole body, in those like really impactful situations. But I also think I felt that before in smaller situations of like, my grandma's staying with him right now, and like we went to a Vikings game once, and grandma stayed with him, and I felt so bad that like he was gonna have a bad bedtime, and like it was almost the same feeling for very different situations. Does that make sense?
Really? Yeah, it's so visceral. And I think, too, what both of you were talking about is that it really, and this is the way it feels for me, too, is just like a lot of indecision. Like, I don't know how to move forward from this because either way, I'm breaking a rule. Either way,
Mm.
there's something that I feel like is not right or doesn't feel good. So it's impossible to know what I actually want to do. Ever, because it feels too bad to feel guilty, and I'm gonna like take that part of my life away for now. Um, or we're kind of like pressuring ourselves into doing things that don't feel right. Um,
Mm.
and that can be equally problematic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that feels right. um, so we actually kind of talked about a lot of this already, but like, would you say there are any like common contributors to mom guilt? Obviously, I think those social expectations are a big one, and we talked about that. Are there any other common contributors or things that you come up with yourself or with clients that are like, this makes me feel guilty a lot of the time?
I think in terms of common contributors, I guess not like things that are frequent sources of mom guilt, but one of the things that can play a role is just kind of like low self trust, low self confidence, feeling like I don't really believe that I know how to make the best decisions. And so it's really difficult to feel assured in picking the path that feels like genuine to me. Um, and kind of like deferring to other people as the experts in making these decisions, whether it's, momfluencer on Instagram or, mother-in-law saying like, I can't believe you do things that way. Oftentimes I think we just feel like, well, they must know better. They seem to have it together, or they seem to have been good as a mom when they were in my shoes. And, who am I to do things differently or to believe that I have some better approach. Um, and I think the thing that's really helpful here is keeping in mind that everyone has a different approach and no one's right or wrong. It's just about figuring out what works for you, which is really hard to do when you don't have a lot of, trust in yourself to be able to make those calls.
Yeah, and really hard to do when the internet will tell you that you're wrong for the decision that you made,
Totally. Oh my gosh.
right?
Yeah. The wars out
Like,
there in the comment sections.
or your mother-in-law will tell you that you're wrong. Not my mother-in-law, but like, your sister. People will tell you that you're wrong, and it's good to have someone like yourself who can validate that and say, no, you're not. You're just different than them. And that feels, what in my experience, what I find is that feels invalidating for that person, right? Where it's a lot of times when people do try to undermine our decisions, it's to bolster theirs up when they're different than ours. I think a lot when it comes to cutting people's decision is to validate their own.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think, nothing ever feels more important than when we're making decisions about how we parent. That's the most
Mm-hmm.
critical thing that we've ever done. And we care so much about doing a good job that we really want to believe that the choices we're making are the best ones and the right ones. And that means that all those other choices are the wrong ones and the bad
Mm-hmm.
ones. And so we really want to cling to the belief that like I am doing things right. That means other people are doing things wrong. This is the path. When in reality, like every
Mm-hmm.
mom knows what's best for her and her family and her baby.
A really great example, a really easy example of this is the comments around working moms and stay-at-home moms. Like, we've all heard that comment, depending on where we are positioned, of, oh, I could never stay home with my kids. I would be too XYZ. Oh, I could never leave and go work. I could never be away from my kids that long, XYZ. And it really is that, like, tell me that I'm right. Tell me that it very rarely is that a comment that's necessary for any reason other than to get some sort of validation or feedback, in my opinion. Anything else you want to talk about as far as like things that contribute to feeling mom guilt more often than not?
I think one just like bigger picture thing that's important to bring into the conversation here is that this experience of mom guilt can be these in the moment sort of scenarios of, do I go on date night or not? Do I ask my husband if I could sleep in and like have him take the morning shift in the morning? Whatever it is, it can be these kind of small instances. And I think those are often the most accessible examples we have. But I think this plays a really big role too in, the maintenance of perinatal mood and anxiety disorders as well, because a lot of the research that we have out there talks about how our expectations of motherhood being full of these like really joyous and positive emotions and thoughts and experiences it can, be a little bit deceiving when we map that onto our real experiences. And oftentimes, what happens for moms is they have their baby, and those experiences are part of the process. But also, there's what we were talking about at the beginning of this chat. There's also a lot of regret and fear and anxiety and overwhelm and guilt and shame and rage and really difficult, painful internal experiences as well. And because there's this expectation that it's all, magical and beautiful, we feel really guilty that is not the full reality of what it's like for us. And so this kind of like self-judgment, this idea that I'm not cut out for this because I'm not having the experiences I'm supposed to have. This must mean something about me. Maybe I'm not the right person for the job. Maybe this isn't something that should be part of my story. Can really fuel the development of some of these kind of bigger problems too. So I think it's just important to factor in how this plays a role in, again, just like bigger picture issues, not just the in the moment mom guilt stuff.
100%.
I think the complexity of this for me is that something I didn't realize early on as a mom was how you could hold two such different emotions at the same time. So you can feel raw and broken and in so much physical pain and also emotional discomfort at the same time as holding the most blissful, happy, joyful, expansive heart you have ever had, falling in love with your newborn. And it's so interesting to think about the fact that as humans, with, living this wild experience, that it's all able to be melded together. And I think that's the thing that I had just seen maybe it was Hilary Swank or somebody like that on the Today Show who had a quote about how, motherhood is the greatest thing she's ever done. It is the thing that has made her the most happy. And I think as a person who hadn't had a baby yet, I would have seen that and been like, oh, that's the full experience. It's just so joyful and exciting. But then you get there and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm so attached. I'm so bonded. I love my baby so much. And at the same time, everything is falling apart.
I think it was you, Caroline, actually, who had this had a reels about this. And what I understand is that maternal ambivalence is extremely normal, but it's something that we don't know about. We're not told that you're going to have these feelings at the same time. And what often is the hardest part about that is the judgment we hold towards it. And you did have a reels about this. And I remember messaging you or commenting on it and being like, this is so well said. It's not that those two feelings are bad at the same time. Those two feelings are happening. It's the fact that you are judging them that often overshadows even the good, right? It's like, well, do I even actually feel this love and these wonderful things if I also feel all of this horrible stuff? And yeah, you do. But when you judge that as I'm bad for having these thoughts, I must not actually feel these good things, because how in the world could I feel those two things at the same time? Enter judgment. I'm a bad mom. I'm XYZ, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And being able to create space for all of these experiences, the duality of these experiences is really so key in moving through that phase, because it's just so much of everything all at the same time. And we can either make room for it and embrace that these kind of seemingly conflicting experiences can coexist, or we can pendulum swing between them and never really feel like we're in the right place or really know which one feels true or real. And so being able to kind of take a step back and just acknowledge that this is equally as beautiful as it is hard. Neither one negates the other is really, I really think that's the key to just kind of making peace with all of the chaos of this experience.
Yeah, I agree. So moving on then, so that was a really great tip already on just like how to overcome that. So what can we do as moms that when we feel either those in the moment pieces of mom guilt, or we have those overarching judgments that we're making on ourselves about the mom that we are versus the mom we expected ourselves to be, what are some different ways we can help to overcome that, or maybe even avoid it in the future?
I think there are kind of like three different elements here that are really useful, and there's a lot of nuance to these, and more than three, but the three that come to mind are um, one, I'll give some background information first. Like, one of the reasons that mom guilt is so tricky for us is because it pulls us into a common thinking trap called emotional reasoning. And emotional reasoning is what we do when we assume that because we feel some way, that must be true. That must be the reality of the situation. So I'll give a non-mom guilt example, which is like, I give a presentation and I kind of fumble through like answering a question from the audience. And I feel like an idiot. I'm like, oh my God, I'm so embarrassed. And I assume that because I feel embarrassed, I must have done something worth feeling embarrassed about. And it's the same thing that happens with guilt, where we feel guilty and we say, this must mean that I've done something bad or wrong, when in reality, sometimes it's just that I've broken some rule that doesn't actually feel applicable to my life. But because I feel that guilt, I assume that I am guilty, that I've done something bad or wrong. So I think with that, one piece that can be really useful is just being able to like name the experience, being able to name like, oh, this is a feeling of guilt. Like I am experiencing guilt right now. That doesn't necessarily mean that I've done something to warrant that feeling. It's just part of what's here right now. So I think being able to just kind of get present with that experience, know what it feels like, and use that as the basis for figuring out, do I want to respond to it, or do I just want to accept this as kind of part of what's happening for me right now. So that's step one, and I can launch into the next stuff, but I'll pause for a sec.
Yeah, I love that. We've talked a little about that with intrusive thoughts, and I really love the key there of being naming the feeling, but then calling it out for. That doesn't mean it's true. Like, I can have this feeling, but that doesn't mean that that feeling is warranted or that I'm doing anything wrong. I think that's a really cool component to that. But
And with that too, just it doesn't mean that it's wrong. I think what can be useful here is, you don't even need to get into the process of trying to decide whether or not it's true. I think what is more useful is like, is it helpful? Is this guilt actually like moving me in a direction that moves me forward in some way? So, we don't even need to get into the battle with ourselves of like, do I deserve to feel this way? It's more just about like, what is this emotion actually doing for me right now? And if
cool.
it's acting as an obstacle, how can I kind of create space to move around it more effectively? But kind of the second piece there, and I think that the naming it and just acknowledging it kind of sets us up to do this work, is thinking about what are the rules that I believe that I've broken here. And so I think kind of, this is a little bit harder to do in the moment if you haven't already kind of gone through this process, but really thinking about what are all the standards and rules that seem to be contributing to these experiences of mom guilt for me. What are all those shoulds that I've been taught in my own life growing up, or that people have been telling me since becoming a mom? What are the things that are weighing me down? So being able to acknowledge and kind of figure out what those are, and then thinking about, well, what are my values? Like, independent of all of that, what is it that's important to me? Like, what do I hope that my kid will be able to say about me at like my 80th birthday party? What kind of mom do I hope that they will have had the experience of? And that can help kind of just like pull us out of the moment and think more about, how are the choices I'm making right now creating like this more holistic experience of my kid's childhood? So for me, like, I hope that my kid says like, yeah, my mom went to work every day and she loved it, and like she did things that were helpful to other people, and she took time for herself, and she came back and felt like renewed and happy and healthy and all of these things. Whereas in the moment I feel like, oh my gosh, like he hates that I'm taking this time for myself. So being able to kind of zoom out, think about those values, and think about, what will that look like at the end of the day? What does that mean kind of for the greater experience of both my experience of motherhood and my kids' experience of childhood? Yeah, that's a long spiel, but really just like getting clear on your values and how those either match or diverge from all those external expectations out there.
Yeah, values work is probably the number one. It was probably the most life-changing thing I ever did. And it absolutely was, because it wasn't until I got clear about my values that I quit my job that was not contributing anything to my life, that I created my journal and day planner that I felt I needed to align with the values in my life. Like, it was a really eye-opening experience, and I would encourage you to all do that. Is that something that you do in your program?
Yeah, there's a whole module on identifying your values, getting really clear on what those are, and then another module on identifying and overcoming the barriers to values consistent living. Because knowing your values is great, but actually kind of putting them into action is where we
Yeah.
really get a lot of meaning. And living a life that's
Yeah.
consistent with our values doesn't mean living a life without guilt or other painful emotions and experiences. It's about doing the things that make our lives feel full and rich and meaningful, even if that means that there's going to be some anxiety or some shame or some embarrassment or whatever it is that comes along with that.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. Yeah, I'm telling you, you guys, that is worth all the money in the world to not only be able to identify those, but to be able to understand how to uphold them and honor them. And it is something that I did through my matrescence education program, and it's something that I think you can do on your own. I have a values worksheet as well, but I think it's really powerful when you have someone guiding you through it and helping you to really understand what those mean. And like you said, understanding how to uphold them, especially when life isn't in full alignment with them all the time. That's which as it usually is not. So yeah, go check that out, you guys, because that's really powerful. But how about number 3?
So, number 3 is self compassion work. So, really just kind of getting into that process of self judgment that comes up when we're feeling like, oh, I'm bad or I'm wrong, or the fact that I'm feeling this way or thinking this way means something really like fundamentally bad about me. Being able to kind of extend ourselves some compassion and just acknowledge, like, this is part of my experience. It doesn't have to mean anything about who I am as a mom. Um, and I think often when we talk about self compassion, especially the folks that could really benefit from self compassion, we kind of have this reaction of like, oh no, I don't want to do like the warm fuzzy like rainbows and butterflies stuff. And that's not what this has to look like. It can, and I think that can be really helpful and have a time and a place. But it's really about just acknowledging, like, yeah, this is a tough moment. What is the utility in continuing to beat ourselves up here? So I think of it kind of from the example of like a sports coach. If you could think of your kid having a coach who's like, you screwed up, your teammates were all let down by what you did, like, you really messed up this season for us. Like, that's probably not the way we want our kids to be coached by someone else. But having someone who's able to say, like, yeah, that was a tough loss. I get it. That was rough. And let's go watch some tape. Let's figure out what went wrong. Let's see if we can move forward here. That's what I think this can really look like. So it's not about like brushing under the rug the things that feel really challenging or the things that feel difficult in our experience, but being able just to acknowledge, like, yeah, that's a tough one. What are we going to do next? Let's just extend ourselves some kindness versus trying to, like, I don't know, punish ourselves out of it. We can either motivate
Yeah.
with a stick or a carrot. So let's use the carrot.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think always framing it in context of your children is helpful. It shouldn't have to be, but it's kind of the same thing of like, how would you talk to your friend? How, like, we're always harder on ourselves than we are with anybody else. And so thinking about how would you talk to your child? How would you feel if your child talked to themselves the way you're talking to yourself? And that is always helpful. Something kind of along those lines that I have done since my son was 7 weeks old. I spent my first night away from him at 7 weeks old, which felt, talk about mom guilt. Like, so many people were like, oh my God, I didn't leave my kid for the first year. How did you do that? And I was like, well, I had the opportunity to go to a really fancy hotel 20 minutes from my house, to get a massage, to go drink Prosecco with my husband by ourselves after 7 weeks of intensive parenting. I wanted that. And
Yeah.
the way I framed that then was, I could either be guilty or grateful. I have this opportunity. I have this reality right now. So I could either be here and beat myself up for being here the whole time, or I could make the most of it and say, I'm here and I'm grateful to be here. And yes, that means I'm not with my son right now, but he's also getting X, Y, and Z from this. He's getting time with his grandparents. His grandparents are getting this time with him. They're making memories. They're doing all of these things. And it was just, like you said, what would be the point? What would be the utility of me sitting there in this gorgeous hotel room being like, you're the worst. You should be at home. What are you doing? Susie Smith on Instagram didn't leave her kid for a year. You should be more like Susie. Like that's not helpful.
Absolutely. And I think with that, this idea of I can be guilty or I can be grateful, it makes me think of this idea that really any decision that we make is going to come with some cost. Like there's just no option where there's not some kind of consequence. So if I go to the fancy hotel, then I'm going to have some guilt. That's going to be part of my experience. If I don't go to the fancy hotel, then I'm going to be resentful that this is, I'm like confined within this new kind of dynamic in my home. And I'm going to wish I was there and feel like maybe I made a mistake by not going. Like either way, there's going to be some challenging part of the experience that requires acceptance. And so we may as well do the thing that is consistent with our values. I think that perspective can feel like a little glass half empty to people, that like kind of no matter what, there's something that you're going to have to pay, figuratively speaking or literally. I also think it's just like really liberating to think that like either choice I make here, any of the choices I make, there's going to be something difficult about it. So that means it's up to me to choose what really works. I don't have to do this like optimizing or cost minimizing, like crazy analysis of what's going on. I can just choose the thing that feels really meaningful in this moment.
Yeah. How interesting is that even the idea that there's, a pro and a con to every choice. There's a pro and a con to the way that you look at that, right? Like you can look at that thought as a negative, or you can look at that thought as a positive. Like there's a pro and a con to the thought. That's just so funny. But I mean, anything else you want to add to that? Like things that have helped you deal with mom guilt, or anything you want to add to that string of conversation?
Yeah, I think the main thing for me has been, tuning in and listening to my body and knowing which choice in any given situation is going to have the greater cost, and a lot of times realizing that like if I'm making pro and con lists or if I'm asking someone else what to do, like I probably am not settled on what my options are and I need to look for a third door type of situation. So my values and how can I navigate the situation so that my heart is truly at peace in whatever the situation is.
It's beautiful. That's awesome. I think that's a wonderful way to end. Thank you, Emmy. Well, Caroline, thank you so much. This has been such a wonderful conversation. I feel so empowered right now to go and like live life as the mom I want to be with less guilt. And so I appreciate you. Before we go, do you want to just let people know where they can find you, your social media, your website, any and all of that?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks so much. I really enjoyed this conversation too. It's always just so fun to connect with other moms. And I think having these conversations is so important because we all share these experiences. Even if they look a little bit different for all of us, we can all kind of relate to that common humanity in this. And I think that's so important in refuting some of the guilt that comes up too. Like, it's not just you. You're not alone in this. Everyone feels it. So thank you for opening the door to that conversation. But yes, I am on Instagram where I share daily kind of tips and information about postpartum mental health. My handle is Dr. Caroline Dickens. I also have, as Sam said, my free mom guilt workbook, which if you found this conversation useful, could be a really nice next step for you. It's free. You can just download it. And it's got 3 different parts to kind of walk you through some of that values identification and what you can do in the moments to figure out, what is the rule that I'm breaking? Is that a rule that actually matters according to my values? What do I want to do next? And then I have my 10-week course online called Becoming Mom that really walks you in depth through a lot of these different processes. So the first half of the course is structured around introducing you to background information about the transition to motherhood and building new skills to help you cope with common challenges that women face during this time. And then the second half really focuses on applying those skills to specific problem areas that a lot of women deal with. So things like anxiety, body image, relationship challenges, making childcare decisions, all of that stuff. And this was the thing that was really important from my own experience. It's exactly what I wish that I had had during this time. So really excited about it. It was a true passion project. So that is there and available. And then I also provide one-on-one therapy to people residing in California by telehealth. So that is an option as well.
Awesome.
So you can find all my information on Instagram, or my website is drcarolineDickens.com.
Wonderful. That's fantastic. Thank you so much for being here.
I really enjoyed this conversation. I agree. I think having these conversations in general, kind of like shining light on this issue, is, super helpful for all of our listeners, because a lot of times these feelings are just sort of like swarming and like living in the shadows, and it's not until that we actually take a look at them that we can be like, oh, that's there and it's part of my life, and it feels hard and it feels heavy, but it doesn't have to feel so heavy because other people experience it too. So thank you so much for everything you had to share with us today.
Yeah. It lifts the veil.
Absolutely.
That's one of my favorite things.
Yeah.
It lifts the veil. There's this imaginary veil over motherhood of who we are supposed to be, and we protect the idea of motherhood at all costs versus seeing it for what it is. And this is a big part of motherhood for a lot of people. So thank you for doing that today and lifting that veil, and a beautiful conversation all around. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you both.
Awesome.
It was so nice.
Thank you again for listening to the Becoming Mama podcast. If you like this podcast, make sure to give it 5 stars on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. If you are on YouTube, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe before you leave. And go follow Dr. Caroline Dickens over on Instagram. You can also connect with Emmy and myself there. All of that information is down in the show notes. Thank you again for being here, and we will talk to you next week.